Hey everyone, welcome to the What is Money show. I'm sitting down today with Mr. Jeffrey A. Tucker, founder of Brownstone. Jeffrey, welcome to the show.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you. Apparently, your fame is notorious and rising. So I'm honored to be invited on your podcast.
Well, I'm honored to have you here. I really appreciate you agreeing to do this. I originally discovered your work through Twitter. You had tweeted out that you thought this was the most important piece you had written in 30 years of writing, I think was the tweet.
Well, the Purge has begun. Is that the Purge?
And it is titled The Purges Have Begun.
Yeah.
And as we were just discussing offline, we're in very pivotal times, uncertain times. And I think this article did a great job of cutting through the noise and hopefully framing where we are in a relevant historical context. So if I may, I'd like to open by reading an excerpt from your piece.
Oh, so fine. Yeah.
You write, quote, "Once the consciousness seeped in and the politicians panicked, we moved quickly from travel restrictions to lockdowns to mask mandates to domestic capacity restrictions to vaccine mandates. Somewhere along the way, we learned to classify people by profession, stigmatize the sick, then finally to demonize the non-compliant. It's been 20 months of intensified controls driven by political leaders from both parties with precious little dissent from media organs." I mean, it gives me chills still to read it just now. And as I've argued a lot, I just don't understand people's embrace of this current climate because, in my view of history, it's like trusting your government to dictate your life has never been a winning strategy.
Well, but that's because you're implicitly a student of Benjamin Constant, who in the early 19th century saw that the possibility that, well, what he saw was that modernity had changed the desiderata of civilization from the ancient world and to modernity. So in the ancient world, we divided a people according to their access to political power. You're in, you're out. You're clean, you're unclean. You suck, we don't. I'm a citizen. I can participate in making the laws and constituting the republic. You, on the other hand, suck by virtue of birth, whatever. And so by the late Middle Ages, at the end of feudalism, we began to discover this, now in retrospect, a very radical idea that every human person is deserving of equal freedom. And that's weird, right? I mean, like in the course of human history, that's a very strange idea, that every single person is deserving of equal freedom and dignity by virtue of their existence, not race, not language, not religion, not geography. Nothing but humanity really matters. And that's an insane idea, and it was an experiment, but it worked. It worked to make the world a more peaceful place. After the religious wars of the late 16th century, everybody just got exhausted. It's like, I don't care if you believe in transubstantiation or consubstantiation or worship the Pope, or it doesn't matter to me as long as you keep to yourself and don't hurt other people. And so we experimented with this idea, and we gradually emancipated the world over several hundred years until we finally got rid of slavery, and then we got rid of institutionalized misogyny and so on, and we aspired to have equal rights. So, but if you think about it, that was a weird experiment, and apparently it's very fragile, right? So, in March 2020, we defaulted back to our rudimentary, revanchist state of brutality, and said, you're essential, you're unessential. This surgery is elective, this one's non-elective. you're Canadian, so you can't go into America. You're American, so you can't go into Canada, and so on. So we began to redivide the world and split the different. And then they invaded our homes and said you can't have more than 10 people here, and so on and so on. So we began to re-experiment with a kind of a feudal ideal instead of an enlightenment idea. And I think like you said, we've all taken for granted this idea of freedom and human rights because that's what you grew up with, and that's what I have more or less grown up with. But I think you and I were both a little bit naive and believing that humanity had learned the evils of the past, and we would never go back. And yet here we are, suddenly surrounded, feeling powerless in a world in which we have, like institutionalized systems that want us to go back, and we don't like it. And we're having to deal with this. We're having to understand the brutality of the world that we've never experienced before, and we're trying to figure out how we can do with it. What do you do? How do you be strategic? How do you fight back? Should you fight back? Or should you just not care? Is the world just nihilistic, and the systems under which we live are relevant, and maybe we should just mind our own business and go to the beach and huddle with our friends? Maybe that's the answer, or maybe there's something we can do. And I would say that question is still unanswered. We know for sure we should protect ourselves. That much we know. What we can do for others is still I would say slightly undecided.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I guess I see this line arcing out of, it goes perhaps a little bit before the Magna Carta, but it was written in the Magna Carta, right? Life, liberty, property. And so these principles started to embed themselves in our consciousness. They ultimately formed, the basis of capitalism, right? The right to life, liberty, property.
Sure.
We sort of twisted it in the US. We swapped out property for pursuit of happiness. Maybe that's
which is sweet in some way.
It's right? Cute, but I think property is much more important than happiness. Honestly, I think happiness is a bit ephemeral, right? It comes if you have freedom, frankly, and responsibility for things. But when you abdicate that, it's a problem. That ushered in the United States, which is the greatest social experiment of these principles in history. We became the dominant power in the world. We've lifted billions out of poverty. Capitalism, even though it's state marginalized, has been a success, in terms of human history. But now it seems like, and maybe this is because we left property out of the equation. It's like now the state has started to turn back on the private property rights of individuals. So are we in, because I know you said March 2020, which I agree is an inflection point, but I think the violation of property rights has been accelerating even before that, right? Post 2008, fiat currency inflation was accelerating. Before that, savings and loan crisis.com, et cetera. So
no, there's never any clean transition in history. Like you can go back and go back and go back, but I know there's certain things about 2020 that March 2020 that are different. The travel restrictions from Europe were a shock. The fact that I'm sorry to keep going back to this, but the fact that I could not legally invite more than 10 people into my home.
It's insane.
It's my home.
Yeah.
Right. The fact that the schools were shut and hundreds of thousands of small businesses were destroyed, while the big boxes were protected and served. So let me ask you something, because I'm a little curious about this. There's no question that access to power determined the extent of your rights over the last 21 months. The extent to which you actually have connections determined whether you could keep your business open and so on. To me, this is a bit of a shock, and then, if you could work from home, you had rights, I guess. Whereas if you're working class and couldn't do that, you don't really have a computer, you don't care about it. You have a cell phone, but you don't care about it. So you're still hustling and delivering groceries. And the New York Times would routinely say for the last 20 months, you should stay home and have your groceries delivered. They didn't say you should deliver groceries, right? So they know who their audience is, right? So there is definitely a class element here,
Yes.
And it's a little bit of a shock to me. And I've always despised Karl Marx, but it's not enough just to despise somebody. You need to understand why their writings were compelling. I'm beginning to kind of understand why his writings were compelling. The class privilege of people with access to some technologies and not others seems to be highly suggestive of political outcomes. And in this case, I'm not sure about the 19th century, the 18th century. I'm not sure about that. But certainly in this case, your access to digital tools seems to have privileged people to be completely disregarding of the interests of the working classes, and the poor. It's a little strange to me because, as I said, I think Marx was basically dumb. And I read his works, I'm like, well, that's wrong. But his core insight that class matters, it might be true,
Yes. Yeah. One intellectual tradition I've been exposed to through Bitcoin is Rothbard libertarianism.
Yeah, sure.
And he makes this excellent point that the very existence of taxation, which is to say revenues generated through coercion, right? It's theft, as Rothbard would say. It bifurcates society into those that benefit from taxation and those that fund taxation. So the taxpayers are the subjects of the tax consumers, as he calls them.
Right.
And I can't help but relate that that the rate at which we're violating the property rights of taxpayers to fund the interest or aims of tax consumers is the rate at which we are decivilizing. And I think it was Ayn Rand that said, property is the basis of all other human rights, right? If you can't preserve the fruits of your labor across time, you can't have any other rights. So we're violating the very foundation of all other human rights. And we wonder why things are being thrown into disarray. Maybe it's a simplistic view, but I think just the economic structure we're in is designed to bifurcate society in that way. So it's not surprising to me that we're seeing it manifest more when we accelerate the violations of property.
Yeah, and I think Murray would say that that's actually the sort of the purpose of politics. As we know politics as we know them.
Yes.
Which involves the state. And the state needs to keep us all in a frenzy of fear.
Yes.
And there has to be some way to divide people, because naturally in a market, we all get along.
Right.
I hope people don't forget, in 2019, you could walk down the streets of any commercial district in any city in the world and have friends all around you and really enjoy your life and meet strangers that are from a different place, and you're so fascinated, where are you from, kind of thing. That was the marketplace. It was the agora, under which we encountered people not like ourselves, but we found value in them and dignity, and we realized something very important, which is that their existence helps me, and my existence helps them. Yes. We had a cooperative relationship. But politics doesn't like that.
Right.
Politics likes something else. Politics likes division and friends and enemies, and it likes hatred, and it likes killing, and it likes blood, and it likes death. Anything to keep the regime alive. The regime has to live, and how it lives is through division and death. And I think this is why Murray hated the state, ultimately. I'm going to have to turn this off. I'm so sorry. This is why he hated the state, because it divided people from each other, you know?
Mhm.
Like we're naturally, as Benjamin Constant used to say, we have a natural interest in getting along with each other.
Mhm.
But the state doesn't want that. You know, the
Right.
state doesn't want us to get along. The state wants us to hate. And we turn against our neighbors, and then we turn to state managers to help us. A lot of my influences here are really due to this book I read called it was by Carl Schmitt. It was written in like 1931, called something of politics, the essence of politics, or something like that. And he hated liberalism in the old classical sense. And he said, look, life without politics is boring and dreadful. All you do is, you know, have backyard barbecues and baseball and surfing. And one day flows into the next, and you get along with others. And he said, like, nobody wants to live that kind of life. Nobody wants to live like that. You really want big things to happen to you, something dramatic. You want upheavals. And the only way we can really achieve that is through politics, through hatred, through bloodshed. And I don't mean just like symbolic enemies. I want blood to flow in the streets, he said. That's where you find meaning. That's how you find meaning in life. That's how you know your life matters, says Carl Schmitt. Now, he was a huge, of course, Nazi. Eventually Nazi. He was put on the Nuremberg trials, and they eventually exonerated him on grounds that he was just a crazy intellectual, so therefore didn't kill anybody. But he killed a lot of people actually with these views. Mm. But that's what he said. It's like our lives have to mean something, and bourgeois capitalism does not give us meaning. It just gives us abundance and peace, and abundance and peace is boring. So politics gives us something, gives us turmoil, gives us difficulty, gives us struggle, gives us heroes, gives us enemies. But he has this other weird comment in there. He's like, so who is the enemy? And his answer is, it doesn't matter. The enemy is whomever the state decides is the enemy. The point of enemy-ness is that it exists. It's not the who, it's the what. So there are people out there who believe this, you know. Wow. And so long as states exist, there will be somebody who's a convert to the Schmittian view. Mm-hmm. You know, if you read Machiavelli, it's the same. Very similar sort of thing. So I think we're being manipulated by forces very much outside of our control. Shouldn't be, but they are. We have the potential as humanity all to get along, through which we find meaning. We should find meaning for ourselves. Yes. Like you have to do this, I have to do this. We have to find out what makes our lives meaningful. But meaning cannot come through violence. It can't come through destruction. It can't come through bloodshed. We tried that in the 20th century, and we found it ghastly and awful. I'll finish my soliloquy with the following observation. Very early on in the lockdowns, I observed that 20-somethings were all in, you know, especially, well, I mean, I drove up to a distillery in Massachusetts, and my favorite distillery, where they previously sold all sorts of fancy liquors and that sort of thing. And this might have been something like March, let me just make a guess, 25th, okay? And she was dressed, you know, in a long sweater dress with gloves, and had a mask over her face and a hat on her head. It looked like a Taliban wife. And she was like this millennial girl who was previously this hipster with rings in every part of her face that she could find to put a new ring in. She put it in and tatted all over the place. And the ultimate freedom kind of girl suddenly became the compliant officer of the state. And I drove up in my my two-seater, you know, S2K convertible and double-breasted suit and said, "Hey, what's going on? You know, let's have some let's do this liquor thing." She said, "Well, we're selling hand sanitizer." And I said, "Well, congratulations for you. It's nothing like making a profit off a pandemic, huh? Good for you." And she said, "Well, that's disgusting. You should not be out having fun during these times." So she flipped from being, you know what I mean, right? She flipped from being, a freewheeling 20-something happy girl to being all in with the pandemic and the religion of lockdowns. Wow. And a few months later, I had her as an intern, I forget now where she was from, but I talked her down from her lockdown ideology a little bit. And one evening, after a couple of cocktails, and I said something to her. I said, "Listen, I have a question to ask you. It's like a little bit weird. This virus doesn't affect you at all. Like, obviously, you should probably get over it and get immunities and move on with life. Like, how come so many of, including you, because I knew when I first met her that she was all lockdowny." Mm-hmm. I said, how come you and so many of your compatriots your age are into this stuff?" And she said, and you know what she said to me? It was the most interesting thing. She said, "Well, this pandemic is the first thing that's really ever happened to us. Ever happened." Yeah. So my mind goes back to Carl Schmitt. What does it mean by happened? So she's 25 years old, 23, 24, I don't know. Every day has happened to her, but nothing meant anything to her until this crisis, this germ, these mandates, this epic event imparted to her some sort of sense that her life meant something. And so she wanted to participate in it. She wanted to become a compliance officer, a Karen, part of the Red Guard, for spiritual reasons, because it seemed to give her some sense of purpose. I guess what I'm saying is, like, we're not going to get out of this until we find some purpose beyond politics, right? Some meaning that's not attached to calamity, right? Yes. We have to figure out how to live happy and fulfilled lives in peace with our neighbors. Somehow we have to figure out how to do that before we can get out of this crisis.
Yeah, so many excellent points there. I'd like to try to respond, and then I'll read another excerpt from your piece here. So I like that you bring up Schmitt, because he has this quote on sovereignty, actually. And he says that sovereign is he who can decide the exception. And this points to me to this historical contention, largely at the state level, but at other levels before that we have organizations of human beings fighting over who gets to make the rules, right? Make and break the rules, make the exceptions to the rules, bend them, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm reminded here of the old Rothschild quote, "Give me a power to issue a nation's currency. I care not who makes its laws," right? It's all about the money at the end of the day. And where you're saying that we need, because this contention, this outside threat, it also has this strange effect of unifying people, right? So I think it was William James talking about the moral equivalent of war. We would never overcome the horrors of war until we had some moral equivalent to it. That war is what unified people, brought people together, arrayed them in a single direction. But I don't think you can get maybe that gives you meaning of life to some extent, but clearly that's not sustainable. You can't have the meaning of life being destroying the lives of others. So it just clearly doesn't work. And I've often thought that the meaning of life is something like people helping people, like the Marcus Aurelius is like, we're like the hands of the left and right hand, the rows of upper and lower teeth were designed to operate together. That's what human being is, really. So I say all that, and I hope we can find a moral equivalent to war, some rule set. And this is where I'll insert the Bitcoin, tying it to Carl Schmitt's point, is that Bitcoin is the first exception-proof database, or the exception-proof money we've ever had. So if sovereignty is based on who gets to make the exception. Nobody gets to make the exception in Bitcoin, thereby maximizing the sovereignty of all of its users. So this is why people, I think, are very wrapped up in its promise. I'll read one more excerpt here, and I'd love to get your thoughts. You write, quote, that the pace has been fiercely fast, but somehow just slow enough that people and media personalities adjust to the new. The cycle proceeds. Last week's shock becomes this week's normal, and then politicians scramble to create the next big intervention, covering previous failures with new nostrums, all while ignoring or censoring opposing views. Have we learned nothing from the Nuremberg trials? Because wasn't that the first point?
because they're in the past. So this apparently every new generation imagines that it is better than its parents and their parents. And so we study history not really to learn not to repeat it. We study history to look down on the absurdities of those who came before, their brutalities, their ignorance, their prudishness, whatever. But we look down on anybody who came before us and go, we are so much better than they. Right? That's why we study history. And we create caricatures. Well, I would never vote for that guy with that tiny mustache and that barking voice. That's preposterous. I don't know what's wrong with those people. I can't believe they supported that idiot. Well, look at that other guy, that Russian guy, Stalin. Oh, right. We would never tolerate that. Pol Pot, give me a break. Mao, his red book? It's filled with inanities. All of us are way more enlightened than that. And so on it goes. Can you believe they had slavery? Why did they think that some people could be chained up by virtue of the color of the skin, and other people, by virtue of their color of the skin, could live in fancy mansions? That's a weird world. We are so much better than they. So we don't study history really to learn lessons. We study history to flatter ourselves. So we block out the lessons, right? We don't learn the lesson that we are fully capable of every bit of brutalism of the past. We don't believe that about ourselves. So therefore, we're blind to seeing it all around us. This is what happens.
Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services, or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin. So, in your view, is it possible to break this cycle of criminality against ourselves? Is it a matter of...
So I've always wanted to believe that. I've always wanted to believe we could break the cycle, and I'm embarrassed actually about some things I used to believe. I used to think that the migration to the digital world would give us infinite access to information, and humanity could become permanently smart. And I feel like a little bit of a naive, Victorian Whig who imagined in 1890 that we would do nothing but make great products and ennoble people ever more progressively. And there was no chance of going back, and yet here we are. So I don't think so. I think we have to. I'm not sure. These are profound questions. I'm not entirely sure I understand, but it seems like we need to have a culture that embraces human rights. Like even Bitcoin, as glorious as it is, can't overcome. I mean, it can persist through, but it cannot finally overcome a world that doesn't believe in freedom. So, along with a blockchain technology, and I want to talk about this, we also need an ideological, philosophical structure of culture that embraces human rights and peace. Like we have to have that. If we don't have that, I'm not sure how. Then we just become survivors, you know.
Right.
And it becomes you know, that Mel Gibson movie. What's that? You know, he wrote like
Braveheart.
No, the one with all the deserts and all the, you know, the driving the cars around.
Oh, Mad Max. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Mad Max, except we have sound money. So, you know, I don't want to live in that world, you know.
Yeah.
And let me just say something about Bitcoin, because, you know, God bless it, right? I mean, during the lockdowns, it never blinked, never once. Never went down. It was never hacked. There was never a 40-day period. There was, you know, when Trump announced 15 days to flatten the curve, Bitcoin didn't blink, right? I mean, like it just like pushed through. And so, and you look at it, like over 20 months, you know, our religions failed, our healthcare systems failed, our schools failed, our travel failed, airlines, supply chains, food delivery. You know, there were massive failures in every sector of life. Bitcoin ignored it all.
Yes.
Clean slice through every state in the world, like a sharp sword.
Brilliantly said, honestly. I have less eloquently said that it was the only thing that didn't shut down in March 2020. Yeah. You know, you brought up slavery earlier, and clearly that's a past that is one of those things we look down on our ancestors, right? I can't believe they would ever do that, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a point I often make. The definition of a slave is someone under an effective tax rate of 100%, where all the fruits of their labor go to the tax authority. So we can all quantify our own personal spectrum of slavery by what our effective tax rate is. And, you know, taxation comes in a lot of flavors, but Bitcoin at least addresses the inflation side of the equation, where we can hold our wealth and our property in a money that cannot be inflated. And my hope would be, you know, that level of freedom somehow reflects back into us and our characters and our actions, that we would strive to establish more of this freedom-focused philosophical foundation you're describing. I guess my view is just that we have this relationship, right? The tools we make in turn make us back. So how do you see the role of technology and tools in establishing this new philosophical edifice?
I wrote a book called A Beautiful Anarchy, which is mostly entirely incorrect, as I look back on it. It's embarrassing. Actually, I think a copy of that book is about $900 on Amazon right now. So, because apparently the publisher, you know, took it out of print or something like that. So I should probably republish it. It's in 3 languages, but the English version is like $900 on Amazon. But it celebrated all the big tech titans, and I imagined a world of information and free flow of ideas. So I had a chapter on the glories of Facebook and the glories of Twitter and the wonder of LinkedIn, and YouTube is magnificent for empowering individuals. And of course, over time, they all became corrupt. They all became basically state voices and state companies. I mean, like, we have a constitution, so the government can't actually violate our free speech rights. Not very well. But can outsource its ambitions. And they outsourced all their ambitions to big tech. So that book was mostly entirely wrong. What I didn't understand is that, you know, all these privately owned companies have a central point of failure. And what we really need are these distributed systems, that transcend a state, the real metaverse, which is to say, above and beyond politics. And those tools are doing extremely well now. And one of my favorite thinkers is George Gilder. He wrote a book called Life After Google, and he said Google's a centralized company, but that's not the future. So I'm fully anticipating all the companies I celebrated in that book, Beautiful Anarchy. I wasn't anarchist enough, in other words, in that book.
Right.
Yeah. True anarchism is not possible without distributed networks.
Yes. Yeah, well said. I saw recently that YouTube is removing the count of dislikes on their videos, largely because these videos out of DC were getting, 1,000 to 1 dislike to like ratio.
Sure.
So,
well, we have a legitimacy crisis with the state at this point. I think the present regime is popular by 36%, according to official polls. Must be much less than that.
Right.
And I swear to you that you can get a third of Americans to believe in anything, that the moon is made of Roquefort cheese. So at this point, I assume that once Biden administration hits 33%, that means it's fully and wholly and completely discredited. Wow. But we are about to experiment with something very interesting. Like what is it? We don't even know the answer to this question. We're going to soon find out. What is it like to live in a Western democracy that where the government is completely delegitimized? Like, what happens then? We know what happened under autocracies and despotisms in one-party states in 1989 and 1990 throughout Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union. I mean, the governments just melted and collapsed. It just fell apart. We don't know yet what that looks like in a Western democracy, especially with a failing currency. So you've got a one-party state right now in the United States. And how many months we have left until they're overthrown? I mean, so they're gonna lose Congress in 12 months. That's a long time. And then 24 months, I'm sure the Biden administration is going to lose, and then we're going to be replaced by the Republicans, which are marginally better, but God knows. But we don't know what this looks like, especially when you're looking at a failing currency. Where you have supply chains disrupted, like fundamentally, where car salesmen have nothing to do in the day because they have no cars, where liquor distributors show up just to do their jobs, but they have no product to sell.
Right.
And people are just scooting around from place to place, sustaining their jobs in hopes of better times, but there's actually no hope of better times because the supply chains are broken. The chips are not going to arrive for another 2 years. Where the food manufacturing plants or having a hard time attracting workers, and inspectors are not willing to show up because they're not willing to get the vaccine. All right, so we've got real problems. A problem of hyperinflation plus shortages, plus an administration that won't hesitate for a second to impose price controls. In other words, the possibility of radical deprivation in 2022, where families have to choose between heating their homes and feeding their children. I mean, what's going to happen then? What's going to happen? And I'm telling you, I don't want this to happen. But the central state always imagines it's in control, but it's not.
Right.
There's certain natural forces in the world, economic laws that operate independent of whatever the central managers believe they can do. We've seen this at Weimar, and we see the revolution, and I don't want this to happen to us. You didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for this. But we could be heading towards like true calamity of astonishing proportions. And I hope that doesn't happen. But if it does happen, I hope people look back at this podcast and go, okay, those guys were right. This is very scary.
Yeah, very scary indeed. And it's a lot. It's a lot to take in. You alluded to this regime, perhaps it's beyond, pulling the strings is beyond our comprehension. So I'd like to understand a little bit more how you view that. What is that regime? Is it the same one that's persisted over time? Like, is this from Weimar to today, or is this just some innate human problem that keeps re-expressing itself? And then to what extent do you think control over the money is necessary for that regime to exert control? Because
they have to have it. And this is why they're panicked. It's actually quite hilarious. I have a friend of mine. Let me just backtrack here. Mm-hmm. So this is 2021. So let's just say this was, let's just say 20, I'm going to make this number up slightly, 2015. Mm-hmm. And I think Janet Yellen was the head of the Fed. So my friend went in with a gang of Bitcoiners into the Federal Reserve offices and said, hey, we've got this great new technology. And it's called Bitcoin. And it's peer-to-peer currency, lives on a distributed network, and its value is entirely imparted by the market, not by authority, not even by gold. It just is what it is by virtue of its ownership status and this ledger that keeps track of it. And she in front of Janet Yellen, she shot a QR code off some charitable site or whatever and sent Bitcoin. And I went through and showed it to Yellen. And she said, wow, that's fascinating. Who processed that transaction? And my friend said, no one. It's just the blockchain. There's these miners and their protocols confirm transactions. So there's no counterparty risk at all. We have no third party trust agencies of trust at all. It's a trustless network in that sense. And Janet had no idea what she was talking about, like none. That couldn't even conceive of it. Now we're talking about 6 years later, so they're a little more sophisticated, but they're still terrified. And what really terrifies them are the stablecoins, because we know what's happened with stablecoins. They've replaced banks. They've replaced the only function that central banks have in the world, which is settlement services. Now, it turns out stablecoins provide settlement services that are, just because like instant, a fraction of the price, with zero counterparty risk, and that unites the world. I mean, stablecoins are glorious, and that's what is. It wasn't even Bitcoin so much that caused the central bankers to panic, but it was more the stablecoins, because they realized that in a free market of competitive remittances, they can't compete.
Right.
So I think that the central banks are looking to destroy the stablecoins. That's my thought, and all the companies that are issuing. But it's way too late for that, right? They can't do it, and that's why they want their own cryptocurrency. It's not so much because they want to empower users. Obviously, they can't come up with a Fed coin that competes with, the top, 300 crypto tokens, right? But what they're really pissed off about is the settlement services. That's what upsets them, because they don't want to be shown up, and they realize that they have to become part of the future, but they can't. They can't become part of this future because they are part of the past, institutionally and otherwise. So we're setting ourselves up for a real struggle, and unless the state can get back money and the services associated with that, they are afraid they're going to go into the dustbin of history as states.
Yeah. It's one of the great promises of Bitcoin, I guess, is that we could build a model of human organization that's non-coercive, which would mean non-statist. And I agree with you. They do see stable coins as an immediate and present threat, but I would argue that is myopic. Actually, they're missing the forest for the trees, so to speak, in that I think Bitcoin is actually disruptive to gold. So they're dealing with something that they, much larger than they can even deal with, because gold still is the game, by the way, right? Central banks still accumulate and hold gold.
Man, they're all old fashioned.
Yeah. To control people, right? It's like the prime geopolitical monetary layer is still gold. So if that layer is being disrupted by digital technology, then the state and the central bank, they've got quite the wild ride in front of them.
I knew this in 2013. I realized very quickly that Bitcoin has all the properties of gold plus certain advantages over gold, namely weightlessness and instant portability around the world without geographic proximity. So, Bitcoin is definitely, I would say, over the long term, replaced gold as the historic role of gold is now Bitcoin.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not fully revealed yet, but yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but your intuition's spot on that it's that limited portability of gold that necessitated the central bank to scale it. So when you optimize the portability of money, as we've done in Bitcoin, the central bank's irrelevant.
Yeah. So if you're irrelevant and you have no market services, what happens to you eventually? Go
away.
I mean, the buggy whip industry was pretty awesome for a lot of years, but by 1925, it became problematic. It didn't matter. Like, you can use all the force you want to, but there's something more powerful than guns and weaponry and power, and that is markets.
Yes, absolutely. Everything is downstream of economics, as I've argued a lot. I'd like to read one more. It's near the conclusion of your piece here, but I think it's very powerful. You write that the symbolic act of medicinal compliance easily becomes a physical sign of political compliance, the ID card. That then becomes the basis of the reductio ad absurdum, the political purge, an intensification of the mask mandate to become a needle mandate as a means of ferreting out dissidents. Thus does this mandate fulfill the illiberalism of our current moment in civic life and serve only to consolidate political power in the end. Pure is never pure enough, which is why Biden now says he demands 98% vaccination rates, and even small children at zero risk are being roped in. All of this will be as ineffective in achieving its aims as the rest of the virus control strategies. Over time, it only fuels public anger and builds a resistance force and gives rise to new institutions determined to preserve and practice the precious right of human freedom.
Whatever drug I was on when I wrote that, I want to take that all the time. That was good. I'm sorry, but that's good.
Send me some too, because that is damn good.
Yeah, that's really good. Sorry to praise myself, but yeah, that's good. Sometimes I don't even believe that I write what I write, actually, because every day for me is new and I don't forget what I wrote. But yeah, that was good. And also, actually, I would say prophetic, because that's exactly what's happening. The shots are no longer medicine, right? It's no longer, we know this.
Yeah.
I think any thinking person who's observing the world around us this is no longer about disease mitigation. I mean, it really is about compliance. It's whether it's a vaccine or a beanie on your head. I mean, they want to see signs of compliance. Mm-hmm. That's what it's all about. And I just have to believe this. I mean, so here's the problem. States have outlived their usefulness. And that happened a long time ago, but it's becoming ever more obvious. So what do you do if you are a state? What are you going to do when history has moved beyond you? When the trajectory of time has called you outmoded? The last time the state did anything really impressive was something like the moonshot, in 1962. I mean, otherwise, there's been nothing but wars and horrors. So this is what's important. They finally seized on epidemiology as a frontier they hadn't quite invaded in a long time. Mm. And they were going to mitigate disease for us. And we were going to all celebrate. Thank you, government, for saving us from a virus. It didn't work. It flopped. Their lockdowns, their restrictions, their closures, and now their vaccines, tax-funded vaccines, and their jabs. It's been 21 months of catastrophic failure. Mm-hmm. So, what's next? The state can be creative too. There'll be a next. I don't know what it's going to be. Mm-hmm. But if I was going to put myself into the mind of a Hegelian, I would say the state is doomed to obsolescence. Mm-hmm. In our lifetimes, I don't know. But it's definitely happening now. When that's complete, I don't know, but it's definitely happening. So we're on this trajectory. We can see it all progressing. We can see what's happening. We can see the state and its managers panicking. Mm-hmm. What's our next source of fear? I don't know. The failure to mitigate this disease, even despite the extreme measures which have gone on for so long, is probably certainly the greatest failure of the government in our lifetimes. Mm-hmm. Maybe in all times. What's next? I hope it's freedom. Real freedom. We shall see.
Amen to that. It seems as though the state, realizing its obsolescence, needed a pretext to reimpose this political divisiveness. And that was this quote unquote pandemic.
Yep. I saw this in 2006 when Bush was going on like a lunatic, in press conferences about the avian bird flu. Mm-hmm. He was like, "Oh, we're going to have to lock down. We're going to have to shut your businesses and close your schools. We're all going to have to get into a tremendous frenzy about this." Unfortunately for him, the avian bird flu never left the avian birds, or whatever birds they were, and entered the human population. So he lost his chance. But that was 15 years ago. And I wrote at the time, I was like, the state is basically obsolete. They failed at everything they've ever done. Yeah. Education, healthcare, national security, you name it. It's one big flop.
Yes.
So we're living in so even in 2006, I said this. I was like, they're looking for a rationale for their existence. Every institution has to have a rationale.
Yes.
What happens when the whole public has just lost belief in an entire institution? Well, now here's what's happening right now. I mean, it's not only the state that's failing, but they're taking all their associated institutions with them. Big media, now big tech, universities and experts, the expertise. I mean, everything that we're supposed to trust is being discredited right now. So we're experiencing this massive loss of trust in everything we used to, that everybody told us we were supposed to trust in, and now they've failed. So, I mean, the more fundamental question is what do you really trust? And that's what all of us are going to ask ourselves right now. What's reliable? What can you depend on? Where's my source of stability in life? What is it? What is not exposed to the contingencies of politics and violence? Where is that? And anything that passes that test is the future.
Well, I think that is a great place to put a button on it. Jeffrey, thank you so much for your work. I mean, your writing is, I've already read it 3 times. Reading it out loud to you here, I got chill bumps again. So thank you so much. I hope it resonates with others the same way it does.
It resonated with me, I must say. It was good. That's good stuff. I just wrote an article today that's not nearly as good. I'm going to post it after we get off. So I should just repost that one. So,
yeah, anyway, you got to get more of those limitless pills you're taking over there because they are good.
You're a very thoughtful interviewer, and I really appreciate how much you've indulged me and allowed me to speak and inspired me to say what I hope are true things. I'm grateful to you and your podcast.
Grateful to you as well. If you could please let my audience know where they can find out more about you.
Oh, sure. And your work. It's the Brownstone Institute is my sanctuary, and that's all you need to know. I also post on Twitter so long as they allow me to. So that's what happens. But I'm in a lot of other places. So, but Brownstone is my my true love. So check it out. I have a rule about Brownstone that every single article must absolutely be valuable and contribute to your life, and I will not publish it unless it does. So that's I think been my editorial rule at Brownstone. So I hope all your readers like it.
That is a great rule, and thank you again for everything that you're doing.